Auntie, why are you crying?
Now close your eyes and count to 10, okay? When you open them, I'll be right back.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
When he reached 10 and opened his eyes, she was gone. The boy stood there holding what was left of his melting ice cream, staring at the empty space where his aunt's car had been. A bus hissed, the crowd moved, the smell of diesel mixed with fried chicken and warm cornbread from a nearby food truck. Strangers passed like shadows, their voices blending into a hum that had no words, only noise. Before we dive deeper, say hi from your country in the comments, and watch till the end, because what you'll witness will break you, and then put you back together. The morning had started differently. Aunt Helen stood in the cramped kitchen of her rental apartment in a neighborhood where paint peeled from walls and generators hummed through power outages, staring at a stack of overdue bills while her husband Mark flipped through channels with the volume too loud. The television cast a blue light across his face, washing out his expression into something blank and unreachable. David sat at the table finishing cereal, his legs swinging beneath the chair, too short to touch the ground. He was 7 years old and had been living with them for 11 months, ever since his mother, Helen's younger sister, died in a car accident on a rainy October night when the roads turned to rivers and the ambulance came too late. Helen hadn't wanted to take him in. She'd said it out loud more than once, to Mark, to her friends, to anyone who'd listen. Ever since he came here, nothing's worked out for us. The furnace broke in the coldest week of winter. Mark's hours got cut at the warehouse where he loaded trucks until his back ached. The car started making that grinding noise that meant expensive repairs they couldn't afford. As if a grieving child could summon bad luck just by existing, as if his presence alone could curse their struggling household. Helen looked at David that morning and saw not her sister's eyes or her sister's smile, but a weight she couldn't carry anymore, a burden she'd convinced herself she had every right to lay down. But that morning, Helen smiled at David, a smile that didn't reach her eyes but fooled a 7-year-old who wanted desperately to be wanted. She told him they were going on a trip, just the two of them, a special day, maybe the amusement park with the spinning rides he'd seen on television, maybe the zoo where the lions slept in the sun. David's face lit up like a candle in a dark room, his whole body straightening with hope. He didn't ask why Mark wasn't coming. He didn't ask why Helen packed so light, just her purse and a bottle of water. He just held her hand and climbed into the car, trusting her the way children trust before the world teaches them not to, before they learn that some hands let go on purpose. They drove for over an hour. The neighborhood fell away behind them, replaced by highways and then city streets lined with buildings so tall they seemed to lean over the road. The city skyline grew taller in the windshield, glass and steel catching the midday sun, throwing light back at them in fragments. David pressed his face to the window, watching the world change from familiar to foreign. He'd never been to the city center before. Everything looked too big, too fast, too bright. Helen's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her jaw set in a way that should have warned him. But he was too young to read the language of adult resolve. She parked near a bus terminal, the kind of place where people pass through but never stayed. A place of concrete benches and flickering departure boards and the smell of cheap coffee from vending machines. Pigeons pecked at scattered crumbs near the trash bins. A man slept on a bench with his bag as a pillow. Helen bought David an ice cream cone from a vendor near the curb, vanilla with rainbow sprinkles, and told him to sit on a bench while she used the restroom. She told him to close his eyes and count to 10, slow and careful, like a game they used to play when he was smaller. She said when he opened them, she'd be right back, maybe with a surprise. She even kissed his forehead, her lips dry and quick against his skin. He closed his eyes, the ice cream cold in his hand, the sun warm on his face. He counted. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. The numbers felt longer when you said them right, when you stretched each syllable like taffy. When he reached 10 and opened his eyes, she was gone. He looked left, then right, his small neck craning to see over the edge of the bench. He called out for her, his voice small against the noise of engines and strangers and the hiss of air brakes from buses pulling in and out. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The ice cream melted down his wrist, sticky and white, dripping onto his shorts. He licked at it absently, more out of instinct than desire, his eyes never leaving the spot where he'd last seen her. A woman with a briefcase looked at him, her expression flickering with concern before she glanced at her watch and hurried away, late for something more important. A man in a security uniform walked past twice, but said nothing, perhaps assuming someone nearby was watching, that this child belonged to someone. David stayed on that bench because his aunt told him to wait, and he still believed she meant it. He believed it even as the sun shifted and shadows grew longer. He believed it even as his stomach started to hurt and his throat went dry. Children believe until the moment belief becomes impossible, and even then, they hold on a little longer just in case. That's when Evelyn saw him. She was 53, a housekeeper at a private estate on the north side of the city. And she'd come downtown on her day off to pick up cleaning supplies from a wholesale store that sold in bulk to people like her who knew how to stretch a budget. She'd just finished loading bottles of bleach and boxes of soap into her canvas bags when she noticed the boy sitting alone on a bench near the terminal entrance. She noticed him because he wasn't crying. He was just sitting there, staring at his shoes, holding a soggy napkin, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Invisible. She wouldn't leave him. Right? The question formed in her mind even as she walked toward him, her bags heavy in her hands. She sat down beside him, slowly, the way you approach something fragile. She asked his name, asked where his people were. David told her the truth in a voice that barely carried over the street noise. "My aunt brought me here. She said she'd be right back." His eyes were brown and wet, but he wasn't crying. Not yet. He was still waiting for rescue to arrive from the direction it was supposed to come. Evelyn's chest tightened. She'd seen this before, in smaller ways, in the faces of children left behind by circumstance or cruelty or both. She looked around for someone, anyone, who might be searching for him. The terminal was busy but anonymous, everyone moving with purpose toward their own destinations. No one came. No frantic woman rushing back with apologies. No security guard making announcements over the loudspeaker. Just the steady flow of strangers who didn't know this child existed. She bought him a sandwich and a juice box from a small shop inside the terminal. She watched him eat slowly, carefully, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to finish it. She asked more questions, gently, the way you coax a frightened animal into trust. David didn't know his aunt's phone number, didn't know the address of the apartment, didn't know the name of the town they'd driven from, only that it took a long time and they passed a bridge with blue railings. Evelyn's mind worked through the options: police station, social services, a system she'd seen chew up children and spit them out into foster homes that ranged from decent to nightmarish. She thought about it. She should have done it, but she couldn't shake the image of him sitting alone on that bench, waiting for someone who was never coming back. Evelyn's friend Sandra, who worked with her at the estate, told her later that night to take him to the police. They were sitting in Sandra's small quarters, the room lit by a single lamp, the sound of crickets drifting through the open window. Sandra was practical, always had been, the kind of woman who saw the rules as lines you didn't cross unless you wanted to get burned. But Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about the boy's face. The way he'd said my aunt, like it still meant something. Like he was still holding on to the idea that family didn't abandon you in bus terminals with melting ice cream. She'd seen too many kids lost in systems that didn't care, shuffled from one temporary place to another until they aged out with nothing but scars and survival skills. So she made a choice that could have cost her everything. She took him home with her. Home was a small room in the staff quarters of the Hargrove estate, a sprawling property where old money lived quietly behind iron gates and trimmed hedges that were shaped like geometry. The estate sat on 12 acres of manicured lawns, gardens that bloomed in careful rotation, and a main house built from stone that had weathered decades without losing its elegance. Evelyn had worked there for nearly 15 years, invisible and reliable, the kind of employee people forgot to thank because she never gave them reason to notice her. She arrived before dawn and left after dusk. She knew which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck in the humidity. She knew the rhythm of the house better than she knew her own heartbeat. Her room had a twin bed with a quilt her mother had sewn, a hot plate for warming leftovers, a radio that picked up gospel stations on Sunday mornings, and a window that looked out at the garden where roses climbed a trellis in shades of red and pink. That first night, she let David sleep in her bed while she took the floor, using a folded blanket as a mattress. The boy was silent for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and she thought he'd fallen asleep. But then his voice came, small and clear in the darkness. "Thank you, Mom Evelyn." She didn't know why he called her that. Maybe because she'd fed him. Maybe because she'd stayed. She didn't correct him. She just whispered, "You're welcome, baby," and listened to his breathing slow into sleep. For 3 weeks, she hid him. She brought him food from the kitchen when no one was looking. Leftover rice, pieces of fried chicken wrapped in napkins, fruit that was too ripe to serve, but still good enough to eat. She taught him to stay quiet during the day, to read the picture books she borrowed from the estate's library when the family wasn't using it, to wash his face in the small sink without making noise. She showed him how to move through the halls like a shadow if he ever had to leave the room, how to listen for footsteps, how to disappear. If you saw this child, would you break the rules too? The question sat heavy in her chest every morning when she woke, but the answer never changed. Sandra covered for her when she could, though she warned her every time with eyes full of worry. "You're playing with fire, Evelyn. You know what happens if Mr. Hargrove finds out. They'll fire you. They'll call the authorities. You'll lose everything you've built here." Evelyn knew. She knew the risks like she knew the lines on her own palms. But every time she thought about turning David over to strangers, she remembered the way he'd sat on that bench, waiting, believing. She couldn't be another person who walked away. But Raymond Hargrove wasn't the man people thought he was. He was 49, tall and reserved, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and decisions that weighed more than money ever could. He'd built his wealth in commercial real estate, buying properties when no one else saw their value, and transforming them into places people wanted to live and work. He was respected in business circles, known for being fair but firm, a man who honored his word. But none of that mattered much to him anymore. He'd lost his wife, Catherine, to cancer 3 years prior, the kind that moved fast and took everything. She died in the main bedroom of the estate, in the bed they'd shared for 20 years, with morning light coming through the curtains she'd picked out herself. Raymond didn't smile much anymore, didn't host dinners or attend galas unless business required it. He worked, he traveled, he came home to silence. The estate felt like a museum of a life he used to live. Her piano sat untouched in the music room. Her garden gloves still hung in the shed. He couldn't bring himself to change anything, but he couldn't bring himself to stay in the memories either. So he traveled. Business trips that stretched longer than necessary. Hotels in cities where no one knew his name. Until one morning, when he returned early from a business trip to find a small boy in the hallway carrying a mop bucket that was too heavy for him. Raymond had come through the side entrance, the one staff used, because his driver had dropped him off near the service road. He'd been awake for 36 hours, his suit wrinkled, his mind still half in the meeting rooms of another city. And then he saw the boy, small, maybe 7 or 8, struggling with a metal bucket that sloshed soapy water with every step. The child's arms were thin, his concentration absolute. He was trying so hard not to spill. David froze when he saw Raymond. The bucket tilted, sloshing soapy water onto the marble floor in a puddle that spread toward the Persian rug. His eyes went wide with fear, the kind of fear children have when they know they've been caught doing something they're not supposed to do. Raymond stopped, briefcase still in hand, and looked at the child with the kind of curiosity you'd give a puzzle piece that didn't fit. He didn't speak immediately, just watched. The boy's clothes were too big, hanging off his small frame. His sneakers had holes near the toes, and his eyes, there was something in them that Raymond recognized. Loss. The same look he saw in his own mirror every morning. Whose child is this? Raymond's voice wasn't angry, just surprised. Evelyn appeared in the doorway like she'd been summoned by emergency, breathless, her apron still damp from scrubbing the kitchen floors. "He's mine, sir," she said quickly, the lie tasting like metal on her tongue. "I'm so sorry. He won't be any trouble. I'll keep him in my quarters. It won't happen again." Her hands were shaking, fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Raymond studied them both. The woman who'd worked for him for 15 years without a single complaint. The boy who looked nothing like her, but stood close enough to her leg that it was clear he trusted her completely. Raymond didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded slowly, his gaze moving from Evelyn to David and back again. "All right," he said finally, "just keep him out of the main areas during the day." Evelyn nearly collapsed with relief, her knees going weak. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Raymond walked past them, his footsteps echoing on the marble, leaving Evelyn to lean against the wall and David to stare up at her with questions he didn't yet know how to ask. But something shifted. Raymond started noticing David around the estate, not in an intrusive way, but in the way you notice a bird that's built a nest outside your window. The boy had a way of moving through rooms like light through glass, quiet but present. He helped Evelyn fold laundry in the utility room, his small hands smoothing towels into neat rectangles. He watered plants in the sunroom, standing on a step stool to reach the hanging ferns, his tongue poking out in concentration. He called Raymond Sir Big Boss, a title that made the older man's mouth twitch at the corners, almost forming a smile. It had been so long since Raymond had heard anything close to laughter in this house that even the echo of it felt foreign. One hallway, one look, everything changes. David reminded Raymond of something he thought he'd lost. Not his wife, not his past, something simpler and more fundamental. The feeling that a house could be more than walls and furniture and memories preserved under glass. The feeling that life could still happen here, small and ordinary and real. He found himself listening for the sound of the boy's footsteps in the morning. Found himself pausing outside the utility room to hear Evelyn teaching David how to fold fitted sheets, her voice patient and warm. Found himself leaving books on the small desk in the staff quarters, children's books at first, then chapter books with worn covers that had once belonged to the library his wife had loved. 6 months later, Raymond had grown fond of the boy in ways he didn't fully understand. It wasn't paternal, exactly, not yet. It was more like discovering you still had the capacity for joy after convincing yourself that part of you had died. He began asking Evelyn questions. How old is he? Where does he go to school? Does he like to read? What's his favorite food? Evelyn answered carefully, never lying, but never offering more than necessary. She enrolled David in a public school nearby using her own address, forging guardianship documents that made her stomach turn, but seemed like the only option. She paid for his supplies out of her modest salary, notebooks and pencils, and a backpack with cartoon characters on it. She packed his lunch every morning and walked him to the bus stop before returning to the estate to begin her day. For a while, it worked. The estate became a strange kind of family, the kind that forms in the cracks of formal structure. Sandra teased Evelyn about playing house, but her eyes were soft when she said it. Raymond left books on David's desk, then later small gifts, a globe, a microscope kit, a jacket when the weather turned cold. He never made a production of it. Just left them there like they'd always belonged. And David, for the first time since his mother died, felt like he belonged somewhere. He had a routine. He had people who knew his name. He had a woman who hugged him when he came home from school, and a man who asked about his homework over dinner in the staff kitchen. But peace is fragile, especially when it's built on foundations that shift beneath you. And jealousy doesn't knock. It claws. Vanessa Cole was Raymond's fiancée, a woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper ambition. She was 38, elegant in the way that made people assume wealth, though most of hers came from calculated relationships rather than inheritance. Her father had been a mid-level government official who died leaving debts instead of assets. Her mother had remarried twice, each time to men with less money than the last. Vanessa had learned early that beauty and charm could open doors, but you had to be strategic about which ones you walked through. She'd been with Raymond for 2 years, a relationship that started at a charity auction where she'd complimented his taste in art, and he'd been lonely enough to appreciate the attention. She tolerated the quiet estate, the long silences, the ghost of his late wife that still lingered in every room like perfume that wouldn't fade. She tolerated it because Raymond was stable, successful, and available. Because she was tired of starting over. Because a proposal seemed inevitable if she just waited long enough. But she would not tolerate being replaced by a housekeeper and a stray child. Vanessa first noticed the shift during a dinner party Raymond hosted for business associates, one of the rare occasions he agreed to open the house to others. She watched him laugh at something David said in the kitchen, a real laugh that started deep in his chest and reached his eyes. She was standing in the doorway with a glass of wine in her hand, and the sound stopped her cold. She hadn't heard him laugh like that in the entire 2 years they'd been together. She watched Evelyn move through the evening with quiet confidence, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, and she saw the way Raymond's eyes followed her, not with lust, but with something worse. Respect, affection, the kind of regard that builds slowly over time and roots deep. Vanessa's smile stayed perfect through dessert, painted on like the lipstick she reapplied in the powder room, but her mind was already working. She was good at reading people, at sensing when the ground beneath her was shifting. She'd been pushed aside before, replaced by younger or richer or more convenient options. She wasn't going to let it happen again. Not when she was this close. She hired a private investigator, a man named Torres, who specialized in digging up dirt on people who thought they were untouchable. He had an office above a dry cleaner in a part of town Vanessa wouldn't normally visit, but his reputation was solid. He found things people wanted hidden. It took him less than a week to find a photograph of Evelyn at a community center with David, holding his hand, both of them smiling. The photo had been taken by a volunteer during a weekend program Evelyn had enrolled him in. Something about art classes for underprivileged kids. Torres traced David's history back to the bus terminal, back to the missing person report Helen had filed 2 days after abandoning him. A report she'd only submitted to cover herself legally, to create a paper trail that said she'd done her due diligence. "Look, officer, I filed a report. I tried to find him. Not my fault if he ran off." Torres presented Vanessa with a narrative she could twist into scandal. This woman took a child that wasn't hers. She's been hiding him on your property for months. She's manipulating you, playing on your grief, inserting herself and this boy into your life for her own benefit. The evidence looked damning when you arranged it a certain way. Vanessa waited for the right moment. She brought the report to Raymond over breakfast on a Tuesday morning when the light was gray and flat through the windows. She'd rehearsed her approach, her tone, even her facial expressions. She sat across from him at the small table in the breakfast nook, the one Catherine had insisted on because she liked the view of the garden. "I didn't want to believe it either," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with concern that almost sounded genuine. "But look at this. Evelyn kidnapped that boy. She's been lying to you for months. Who knows what else she's hiding?" Raymond stared at the documents, his jaw tight. He wanted to believe Evelyn, wanted to call Vanessa paranoid or jealous or both, but the evidence looked perfect. Official letterhead, police reports, a timeline that made sense if you didn't know the full story. And Vanessa's tears looked real, glistening at the corners of her eyes like she was genuinely worried about him. Doubt is a poison that works fast, especially when it's mixed with guilt and exhaustion and the fear that you've been a fool. What would you believe if the evidence looked perfect? He called Evelyn into his office that evening. The office was a room of dark wood and leather chairs and shelves lined with books he'd stopped reading. She stood in front of his desk, hands folded, her spine straight despite the fear running through her like electricity. She already knew what was coming. She'd seen Vanessa watching her all week, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Raymond didn't yell. He didn't accuse her of being a criminal or a liar. He just asked her to leave. Effective immediately. He said he'd give her a month's severance, more than generous considering the circumstances, but she had to go, tonight. Evelyn didn't defend herself, didn't explain. She could see in his eyes that he'd already made up his mind, that the evidence Vanessa had presented was louder than anything she could say. She just nodded once, her throat too tight for words, and walked out of his office with her dignity intact, even as her heart shattered. David tried to run after her as she walked toward the gate with a single bag over her shoulder, everything she owned in the world reduced to what could fit in worn canvas. He was screaming, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his face. "Don't leave me, Mom Evelyn. Please don't leave me." Sandra held him back, her arms wrapped around his small body as he fought against her, his sneakers scrabbling on the gravel. Evelyn turned one last time, tears streaming down her face, her vision blurred. She mouthed the words, "I love you," before the gate closed between them with a clang that sounded like finality. Have you ever watched a good heart punished for telling the truth? Evelyn found work at a bakery on the east side, a small place called Sweet Grace that smelled like butter and cinnamon and barely paid enough to cover rent. The owner was an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who asked few questions and paid in cash. Evelyn moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat where the walls were thin and the pipes clanged at night. The apartment had a hot plate, a mattress on the floor, and a window that looked out at a brick wall. She cried herself to sleep every night for 2 weeks, mourning the boy she couldn't save and the man who wouldn't trust her. Her pillow stayed damp. Her eyes stayed swollen. But she kept going because that's what people like her did. They survived. She kneaded dough in the early morning hours, her hands working the rhythm her grandmother had taught her decades ago. She smiled at customers even when her face hurt from the effort. She learned the regular's orders: 2 sugars, no cream, whole wheat, toasted. The almond croissant, warmed. She existed. She endured. David, meanwhile, withered under Vanessa's cold gaze. She moved into the estate full-time after Evelyn left, claiming she wanted to help Raymond through this difficult period. But her help felt like control wrapped in silk. She criticized David's table manners at dinner, told him to sit up straight, to chew with his mouth closed, to stop fidgeting. She told him to stop calling Raymond by that ridiculous nickname. Sir Big Boss was childish, she said. Inappropriate. You need to learn respect, she reminded him in small and cutting ways, that he didn't belong there, that he was charity, that his presence was tolerated, not wanted. Raymond saw it. He saw the way David's shoulders hunched at the table, saw the way the boy's laughter disappeared, like someone had turned off a switch. But he said nothing, buried under guilt and pride and the weight of a decision he couldn't take back. He told himself Vanessa was just trying to impose structure, discipline, that maybe the boy had been coddled too much. But at night, alone in his room, he stared at the ceiling and wondered if he'd made a mistake so large he'd never be able to fix it. Would you forgive a mistake this big? 3 months passed in a kind of gray fog. Raymond went through the motions: work, meetings, dinners with Vanessa where they talked about wedding plans he couldn't muster enthusiasm for. David went to school and came home and disappeared into his room. The estate was quiet again, the way it had been before. But it wasn't peace. It was the absence of life. Then the investigator, Torres, did something Vanessa didn't expect. He developed a conscience. Or maybe he just got tired of her refusing to pay him the full amount she'd promised, always claiming she needed to see more evidence, always stalling. Either way, he contacted Raymond directly one afternoon, showing up at his office downtown without an appointment. He handed over the unedited file, the one that showed the whole truth. Evelyn hadn't kidnapped anyone. She'd rescued a child left at a bus terminal by his own family. She'd given him food, shelter, and love when no one else would. There was no crime, only kindness. Raymond sat in his office for an hour after Torres left, staring at the papers spread across his desk, feeling the floor drop out from under him. Every page was a piece of evidence that he'd been wrong, that he'd thrown out the one person who'd brought light back into his life because he'd been too proud to ask questions, too quick to believe a woman who smiled with her mouth but never with her eyes, too afraid to trust something that felt too good to be real. The weight of it pressed down on his chest until he couldn't breathe properly. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the estate without telling anyone where he was going. Vanessa called after him from the living room where she was arranging flowers, but he didn't stop. He got in his car and drove toward the east side of the city, toward the address Torres had included in the file. 3 months later, on a gray Saturday afternoon, the city smelled like rain and exhaust when everything changed again. He found Evelyn on a street corner outside the bakery, standing with a tray of sample pastries, trying to lure in customers from the sidewalk. She looked thinner than he remembered. Tired. Her uniform was a simple apron over jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a bun that had come loose. But when she saw his car pull up to the curb, her eyes went wide, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to pause, traffic noise fading into background static. Then the back door opened, and David jumped out, running toward her with the kind of speed that only happens when love has been waiting too long. When someone you've mourned as lost suddenly becomes real again. He collided with her, wrapping his arms around her waist, nearly knocking the tray from her hands. She dropped to her knees right there on the sidewalk, pastry scattering, and held him like she'd never let go, like she could absorb him back into her bones where he belonged. She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his hair. She whispered his name over and over like a prayer. Raymond approached slowly, hands in his pockets, shame written across every line of his face. His throat was tight. His eyes burned. "I should have trusted you," he said, and the words felt inadequate, too small for the size of his mistake. Evelyn looked up at him, tears on her cheeks, and shook her head slowly. "Sometimes love sees what the eyes miss," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. She didn't ask for an apology, didn't demand explanations or groveling. She just stood up, holding David's hand, and asked if they wanted to come inside for coffee. They sat in the back room of the bakery, surrounded by flour sacks and cooling racks, and talked. Raymond told her everything. The lies Vanessa had fed him, the evidence that looked so convincing, his own cowardice in not asking Evelyn for her side of the story before making a decision. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her hand never leaving David's. When Raymond finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't blame you for protecting what you love. I just wish you'd known I was doing the same thing." But Vanessa wasn't finished. Rejection turned her vicious in the way only a certain kind of person becomes when they realize they've lost control. She'd spent 2 years positioning herself for a life she thought was guaranteed, and in a matter of days, it had slipped through her fingers. Raymond ended their engagement that Sunday evening, handing her the ring back in a black velvet box and telling her it was over. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just smiled, cold and sharp, and said, "You're making a mistake you'll regret." She leaked photos to a tabloid that specialized in scandal and innuendo. Images of Raymond and Evelyn together, taken from angles that suggested intimacy even when there was none. She spun them into a story about infidelity and manipulation, painting Evelyn as a gold digger who'd seduced her employer while his fiancée stood by faithfully. The headlines were brutal. Business mogul dumps, fiancé for housekeeper, rags to riches, the maid who stole a millionaire's heart. The articles were full of speculation and half-truths and quotes from unnamed sources who claimed to know the real story. Raymond's business associates started calling, concerned about his reputation. His publicist suggested a statement. His board members hinted that this kind of negative attention was bad for the company's image. Raymond refused every suggestion. Instead, he held a private meeting with his legal team and told them to prepare for a lawsuit against the tabloid and anyone involved in spreading lies. He didn't care about the cost or the attention. He cared about protecting Evelyn from being dragged through mud she didn't deserve. Vanessa watched her plan unravel, watched Raymond stand by Evelyn publicly, and decided to play her final card. If she couldn't have Raymond, she'd take what he cared about most. She contacted her driver, a man named Gaines who owed her more favors than he could count. Gaines was in his 40s, thick-necked and quiet. The kind of man who did what he was told and didn't ask questions as long as the money was good. Vanessa gave him specific instructions. David's school, the pickup time, what to say, what to show. David's school didn't have the tightest security. It was a public elementary school with overwhelmed teachers and an office staff that rotated every semester. Gaines arrived at pickup time with forged temporary custody papers he'd paid someone $200 to create. The documents looked official, signatures, notary stamps, court seals. He told the teacher at the pickup line that he was a family friend sent by Mr. Hargrove because of an emergency. The teacher, a young woman in her first year who was juggling 23 students and a splitting headache, checked the paperwork, saw the signatures, saw David's name. Released the boy into Gaines's custody with a reminder to buckle his seatbelt. David climbed into the car because Gaines told him they were going to surprise Evelyn at the bakery. Maybe pick up cupcakes. Maybe stay for dinner. He didn't realize something was wrong until they passed the bakery and kept driving. He asked where they were going. Gaines told him to sit still and be quiet, his voice flat and final. Panic started to bloom in David's chest, sharp and cold, tightening around his lungs. But he stayed silent, the way children do when they sense that making noise might make things worse, when they understand instinctively that the adult in control is not safe. What would you pay to get him back? Raymond got the call an hour later. He was in his office at home reviewing contracts when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. It was the school secretary, her voice shaking with panic and apology. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm so sorry. There's been a mistake. David was picked up by someone we thought you sent, but now we're not sure. We tried calling the number on the paperwork, but it's disconnected." The world tilted. Raymond's vision narrowed. He didn't waste time asking how it happened or whose fault it was. He called the police, then his security team, then every contact he had who could move fast and ask questions later. Evelyn arrived at the estate within 20 minutes, her face pale, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Mrs. Chen had driven her, refusing to let her take the bus in this state. They stood together in Raymond's office, staring at a map the security team had spread across his desk, waiting for updates, holding on to hope like a rope in a storm. Evelyn couldn't speak, couldn't think beyond the image of David scared and alone somewhere, wondering why no one was coming for him. Evelyn paced the office, her shoes wearing a path in the expensive rug Raymond's late wife had chosen years ago. Her breath came in short gasps, each one catching in her throat like a fishhook. Raymond stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, urgent tones to people who promised they were doing everything they could. Everything felt too slow. Every minute that passed was another minute David spent afraid, another minute he might think he'd been abandoned again. The thought made Evelyn's knees weak. She gripped the edge of Raymond's desk to steady herself, her knuckles going white. Sandra arrived with tea nobody drank. The police sent 2 detectives who asked questions that felt pointless. What was David wearing? Did he have any identifying marks? Had there been any threats? Raymond answered mechanically while his security chief, a former police captain named Morrison, worked his own contacts. They pulled traffic camera footage. They traced the fake custody papers to a print shop in a strip mall. They found the clerk who remembered the man who'd ordered them. Thick neck, quiet, paid cash. The police traced Gaines's phone to a motel on the outskirts of the city, a place called the Restway Inn, where rooms rented by the hour and questions weren't asked. It was the kind of establishment where the carpet held stains that had their own stories, and the neon sign out front flickered the letter E, so it read Restway Inn in pink and blue. The parking lot was half full of cars that had seen better decades. Room 118 was on the ground floor, curtains drawn, a silver sedan parked directly in front. They moved in quietly. No sirens, no drama. Raymond had insisted on coming, and the police hadn't been able to stop him. He stayed behind the line of officers, Morrison's hand on his shoulder holding him back. Evelyn waited in the car with Sandra, praying in a way she hadn't since she was a child, sitting in her grandmother's church. The words tumbling over themselves. Please God, please God, please. When they broke through the door, David was sitting on the edge of a bed with a floral bedspread that smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner. He was scared but unharmed, his backpack still on his shoulders like he'd been ready to run if he got the chance. Gaines was on the phone with Vanessa, arguing about money, about how this wasn't what he signed up for, about how kidnapping a kid was different from the other favors she'd asked. The police had him on the ground in seconds, his phone skittering across the stained carpet. Vanessa's voice still coming through the speaker, asking if he was still there. David saw Raymond in the doorway and burst into tears, the kind of crying that comes from holding everything in until you can't anymore. Raymond crossed the room in 3 strides and picked him up, holding him so tightly the boy could barely breathe. David wrapped his arms around Raymond's neck and sobbed into his shoulder, his whole body shaking. "I thought nobody was coming," he whispered. "I thought I was alone again." The arrest was swift. Vanessa was taken into custody within hours, pulled from a hair salon where she'd been getting highlights, like nothing unusual was happening. The stylist later told reporters that Vanessa hadn't seemed surprised when the officers walked in, just annoyed that they were interrupting her appointment. She was charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, child endangerment, and falsifying legal documents. Gaines was charged with kidnapping and took a plea deal almost immediately, giving testimony that buried Vanessa's defense before it even started. Her lawyer tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, a mental breakdown brought on by stress. But the evidence was clear. The forged papers with her fingerprints on them. The phone records showing 17 calls between her and Gaines in the week leading up to the kidnapping. Gaines's full confession, recorded and notarized, laying out every detail of her plan. The prosecution didn't even need to work hard. The case built itself. David came home that night to the estate, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like the police station, holding Evelyn's hand like it was the only solid thing in the world. She hadn't let go of him since Morrison brought him out of the motel room. Raymond had tried to take him, but David had reached for Evelyn first, and something in Raymond's chest had cracked open at the sight of it. This was his mother. Not by blood or law, but by choice and love and the 1,000 small acts of care that build a family. Raymond knelt in front of him in the foyer of the estate, the chandelier casting soft light over them all. He looked at David's face, still streaked with tears, still pale with fear. "Are you okay?" he asked, and his voice broke on the question. David nodded slowly. Then he asked the question that broke both adults in half. "Are you going to send Mom Evelyn away again?" Raymond looked at Evelyn, and something passed between them that didn't need words. All the guilt and regret and wasted time seemed to gather in the space between them and then dissolve. "No," Raymond said, his voice steady despite the emotion choking him. "Never again. I promise you, son." Never again. The word hung in the air. Son. Raymond hadn't meant to say it, but once it was out, he realized it was true. Had been true for longer than he wanted to admit. David looked at him with wide eyes, processing, and then nodded once like a contract had been sealed. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that comes after a storm, when the air feels washed clean, but everything is still settling back into place. Vanessa pleaded guilty to avoid a trial that would have put her face on every news channel in the state. She was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility, with credit for time served and the possibility of parole after 18 months if she behaved. The tabloids moved on to other scandals, a politician's affair, an actress's divorce, the endless churn of other people's misery. Raymond's business stabilized. The board stopped calling with concern. Life resumed its rhythm. And Evelyn, instead of returning to the staff quarters, was offered a position as head house manager. The title came with a real salary, triple what she'd been making, It came with benefits, health insurance, retirement contributions, paid vacation. It came with an apartment on the property, a renovated space in what used to be the guest house, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with granite counters and a living room that got morning sun. She accepted, not because she needed the title or the money, though both helped. She accepted because it meant David would have a room of his own, a real room with a door that closed and a window that looked out at the garden and space for books and toys and all the things children should have. David's room had blue walls and a bed shaped like a race car, and shelves Raymond spent an entire Saturday installing, measuring twice and still getting one crooked. Evelyn hung curtains with stars on them. Sandra donated a lamp shaped like a rocket ship. The room became a space that said, "You belong here. You are wanted. You are home." Raymond started appearing in the kitchen every morning, claiming he needed coffee, even though the pot in his office worked just fine. Evelyn pretended not to notice the way he lingered, leaning against the counter, asking about her day, offering to help with dinner, even though he'd never cooked anything more complicated than toast. She pretended not to notice the way his eyes followed her when she moved through the room, or the way he smiled when David told stories about school, or the way he'd started calling her by her first name instead of Mrs. Jefferson. David noticed everything and made no effort to hide his grin. He watched them dance around each other like 2 people who'd forgotten how to say what they meant. One morning, while eating cereal at the kitchen table, he looked up from his bowl and asked, plain as daylight, "When are you going to marry Mom Evelyn?" Raymond choked on his coffee, coughing into his fist, his ears turning red. Evelyn blushed and swatted David's shoulder with a dish towel, her own face warm. "Where did that come from?" she asked, but she was smiling. David shrugged, spooning cereal into his mouth. "Just asking. You guys like each other, I can tell." Raymond cleared his throat, setting his mug down carefully. "That's complicated, buddy. Evelyn and I are still figuring things out." David looked at him with the kind of direct honesty only children possess. "Doesn't seem complicated to me. You're happy when she's around. She's happy when you're around. And I'm happy when you're both around. Seems pretty simple." Evelyn turned away, busying herself at the sink, but her shoulders were shaking with silent laughter. Raymond sat there, thoroughly defeated by the logic of an 8-year-old, and couldn't think of a single thing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. So he just smiled and ruffled David's hair and let the question hang in the air like a promise waiting to be kept. The months turned into a year. Then 2. David grew taller, his voice started to change, his feet got too big for his shoes every few months. He joined the soccer team at school. He made friends who came over on weekends and ran through the gardens and ate sandwiches Evelyn made, piled high with everything they could fit between 2 slices of bread. He got his first A in math and framed it on his wall. He lost his first tooth and put it under his pillow, even though he knew exactly who would leave the money there. Raymond and Evelyn's relationship grew in the slow, steady way of people who'd both been hurt before and were careful with each other. They had dinner together after David went to bed, sitting in the kitchen with wine and conversation that meandered from books to travel to memories they were finally ready to share. He told her about Catherine, about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save her. She told him about her own losses, parents who'd died too young, a sister who'd moved overseas and stopped calling, the quiet loneliness of being invisible in a world that only saw your work, never your worth. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in spring, in the garden where the roses climbed the trellis and the air smelled like jasmine. She'd been telling him about a book she'd read, gesturing with her hands the way she did when she was excited about something. And he'd realized he wanted to do this for the rest of his life. Listen to her talk about things that mattered to her. Watch her face light up. Be the person she came home to. So he'd leaned in and kissed her, gentle and tentative, giving her space to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. She kissed him back, her hand coming up to cup his face, and it felt like the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. David caught them holding hands one afternoon and pumped his fist in the air like his team had scored a goal. Finally, he said, and went back to his homework like he'd been waiting for this development since the beginning. Years later, the years that followed were quiet and good. There were Sunday calls that never skipped, holidays that sounded like home, and small road trips that traded grand plans for coastlines and old bookstores where they could spend hours browsing shelves that smelled like paper and time. Someone always claimed they'd improve the recipe on the fridge. Raymond's chicken stew that used too much pepper, Evelyn's banana bread that could have used more sugar. But no one ever changed it because the arguing about it was part of the tradition. Mornings slowed down on purpose. They ate breakfast together when they could, reading sections of the newspaper aloud, arguing gently about politics and sports and whether it was going to rain. Nothing public, nothing grand, just an ordinary life, held carefully. David graduated high school with honors, his name called across a stage while Raymond and Evelyn stood in the audience, their hands clasped together, their eyes wet with pride. He'd grown into a thoughtful young man, tall and broad-shouldered, with his mother's smile and a quiet kindness that made people gravitate toward him. He'd spent his teenage years volunteering at the community center where Evelyn had once taken him for art classes, helping younger kids with homework, teaching them that being abandoned didn't mean you were worthless. He went to college on a scholarship, studying education because he wanted to teach. He said he wanted to be the kind of teacher who saw the invisible kids, the ones sitting in the back row with holes in their shoes and hunger in their eyes, the ones who needed someone to notice they existed. Raymond helped him move into his dorm room, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs while David and Evelyn argued about whether he needed a rug. Evelyn cried the whole drive home, happy tears mixed with the sadness of watching someone you love step into their own life. 4 years later, David graduated college with a degree in education and job offers from 3 different schools. He chose the one closest to home, a public elementary school in a neighborhood that reminded him of where he'd come from. He wanted to teach the kids who needed it most. His first day, he wore a tie Raymond had given him and carried a briefcase Evelyn had bought. And he called them that evening to tell them about his classroom, about the 23 students who'd looked at him with curiosity and hope and a little fear, about how he'd told them his own story so they'd know their teacher understood what it meant to start from broken. That night, at a small dinner in the estate's dining room, the formal one they rarely used, with the long table and the chandelier and the paintings on the walls, Raymond stood up and cleared his throat. Evelyn and David looked at him, curious, and he felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't a man who liked speeches, wasn't comfortable with grand gestures, but some things needed to be said out loud with witnesses, so there was no doubt left in the world. He looked at Evelyn, who'd been beside him for over a decade now, who'd taught him that love could be rebuilt from ruins if you were patient and brave enough. He looked at David, the boy who'd stumbled into his life carrying a mop bucket and had somehow saved him from a future of silence and regret. He looked at them both and felt the weight of gratitude so heavy it hurt. "I'm not good at this," he started, and Evelyn smiled because that was the most Raymond thing he could have said. "But there are things I need to say." He turned to David first. "You came into my life when I'd forgotten what it meant to hope for anything. You reminded me that family isn't about who shares your blood, It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves you even when you're difficult or scared or making mistakes. You did that for me, even when you were just a kid. Especially when you were just a kid, his voice cracked. I know I failed you when I sent Evelyn away. I know I hurt you both. But if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life making up for that. David's eyes were wet. He nodded, unable to speak. Raymond turned to Evelyn. And you've been patient with me in ways I didn't deserve. You've built a home in this house that I turned into a museum. You've loved a broken man and a lost boy, and somehow made us into a family. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, his hands shaking slightly. The ring was simple, gold with a single diamond, nothing flashy or ostentatious, just beautiful in its honesty. He knelt down on one knee, right there in the dining room where Catherine's portrait still hung on the wall, and he felt no guilt about it. Catherine would have liked Evelyn, would have wanted him to be happy, would have laughed at how long it took him to get here. Evelyn, will you marry me? Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. She nodded before he even finished speaking, nodding so hard her whole body shook. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. David burst into tears, the good kind, the kind that come from joy so pure it has nowhere else to go. He pulled them both into a hug that lasted longer than any of them expected, the three of them standing there in a circle, holding each other like they were the only solid things in a spinning world. You gave me the family I prayed for, David whispered, his face pressed against Raymond's shoulder. Raymond's voice was thick when he replied, and you gave me a reason to believe again. Sandra, who'd been watching from the doorway with a tissue pressed to her face, started clapping. Then she was crying too, and laughing, and soon they were all laughing and crying and making plans. The wedding would be small, they decided, just the people who mattered. The estate garden in late summer when the roses were at their peak. Nothing formal, nothing stiff, just family. The wedding was exactly what they'd planned. Evelyn wore a simple ivory dress that made her look like she was glowing from the inside out. Raymond wore a suit without a tie because David convinced him it was too formal for a garden ceremony. David stood beside Raymond as his best man, tall and proud, holding the rings in his pocket and trying not to cry before the ceremony even started. Sandra stood beside Evelyn, her oldest friend, the one who'd covered for her all those years ago when she'd hidden a 7-year-old boy in her quarters. The ceremony was short and sweet. The officiant was a retired judge Raymond knew, a woman with kind eyes who spoke about love as a choice you make every day. Evelyn and Raymond exchanged vows they'd written themselves, words about second chances and found families and building a home out of broken pieces. When the judge pronounced them married, David cheered so loudly that birds scattered from the trees. The reception was held right there in the garden, with string lights hung between the trees and a small jazz band playing soft music. They ate food Evelyn had helped prepare, danced on grass instead of marble, talked and laughed and celebrated not just a marriage, but a family that had formed against all odds. David danced with Evelyn, then with Sandra, then tried to get Raymond to dance and succeeded after enough cajoling. Raymond was a terrible dancer, stiff and self-conscious, but Evelyn loved him for trying. As the sun set and the lights twinkled on and the music played, David stood between his parents. That's what they were now, legally and in every way that mattered, and felt something settle in his chest. Something he'd been missing since the day his mother died and the day his aunt left him on a bench with melting ice cream. He felt like he belonged, like he was wanted, like he was home. The years continued to unfold gently. Raymond and Evelyn traveled together, taking trips they'd both dreamed about but never thought they'd experience. They went to the coast and walked on beaches where the sand was white and the water was clear. They went to the mountains and hiked trails that left them breathless and exhilarated. They went to cities they'd never seen and got lost on purpose, finding small restaurants and hidden bookshops and moments that became memories. David taught his students with the same care Evelyn had shown him. He noticed the quiet ones, the ones with worn shoes and tired eyes. He kept granola bars in his desk for kids who came to school hungry. He stayed late to help with homework. He called parents not to complain, but to celebrate small victories. He became the teacher he'd needed when he was young. He met a woman named Claire at a teacher training seminar, a kindergarten teacher with a quick laugh and a passion for literacy. They fell in love slowly, over coffee and conversations and a shared belief that every child deserved someone in their corner. He brought her home to meet Raymond and Evelyn on a Sunday afternoon, nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a child. But Evelyn hugged Claire immediately, and Raymond asked her about her work. And by the end of dinner, it was clear she fit. David proposed to her a year later in the same garden where Raymond and Evelyn had married, and both of his parents cried happy tears. David and Claire's wedding was bigger, fuller, louder. Students and parents and colleagues filled the chairs. Claire's large family from the southern part of the country arrived in buses and filled the estate with music and laughter. Raymond gave a speech that made everyone cry, and then laugh when he joked about how David had once asked when he was going to marry Evelyn, and how that kid had been right all along about everything. Time moved the way it does when life is good. Not slow, not fast, just steady and full. Raymond retired from the day-to-day operations of his business, keeping a hand in but spending more time at home. He and Evelyn took up gardening together, working the soil side by side, planting things they'd harvest together. They read books in the evenings, sitting in the library with tea and companionable silence. They grew old together in the way people do when they're genuinely happy. David and Claire had children, a daughter they named Catherine after Raymond's first wife, and a son they named Marcus after Evelyn's father. Raymond and Evelyn became grandparents, a role that filled them with more joy than they thought possible. They watched David become the father he'd never had, patient and present and proud. They watched him build the family he'd once thought was impossible. On David's 35th birthday, the family gathered at the estate for a celebration. The children ran through the gardens Raymond and Evelyn tended. Claire helped set up tables outside. Sandra, older now but still sharp, directed everyone with the authority of someone who'd been part of this family longer than most. They ate good food and told old stories and laughed at jokes they'd heard 100 times but never tired of. As the evening settled into comfortable quiet, David stood and clinked his glass, asking for everyone's attention. He looked around at the faces he loved, his wife, his children, his parents who'd chosen him when they didn't have to. "I want to say something," he started, his voice steady but emotional. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about where I came from and where I am now." He looked at Raymond and Evelyn, sitting close together, their hands intertwined the way they always were. "When I was 7 years old, I thought my life was over. I thought being left on a bench meant I didn't matter, that nobody wanted me, that I was just a burden people got rid of when I became too much." His voice caught. "But you both taught me something different. You taught me that family isn't about who gives birth to you or shares your blood. It's about who sees you when you're invisible, who feeds you when you're hungry, who stays when everyone else walks away." Evelyn was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. Raymond's jaw was tight, his own eyes glistening. I didn't return to seek revenge against the aunt who left me, David continued. I didn't return to prove anything to anyone. I returned as something simpler and more powerful than that. He paused, looking at each person gathered there. I returned as a son, as a man who understands that love is a choice we make every single day. That family is built, not born. That home is wherever people choose to keep you. He raised his glass. To the people who stayed, to the people who chose me, to Mom and Dad, thank you for showing me what family really means. Everyone raised their glasses, voices mixing in agreement. Raymond stood and pulled David into a hug that lasted long and said everything words couldn't. Evelyn joined them, and then Claire, and then the children, until they were all wrapped up together in the gathering darkness, held together by something stronger than blood. He didn't return for revenge. He returned as a son. The boy who was left at a bus terminal with melting ice cream grew into a man who understood that family isn't about blood. It's about who stays, who kneels beside you when you're small and scared, who fights for you even when the world says you're not worth it. He returned not as a millionaire or a hero in the traditional sense. He returned as someone who knew the value of love because he'd lived without it and then been given it freely by two people who chose him when they didn't have to. He returned as living proof that being thrown away doesn't define your worth, that being picked up and held close by the right people can rewrite every story you thought was already written. He returned as a teacher who changed lives because his own life had been changed, as a husband who loved fully because he'd been loved without condition, as a father who showed up because people had shown up for him, as a son who understood that the truest families are the ones built from choice and courage and the stubborn refusal to walk away. If this were your family, could you forgive like this? Who in this story broke your heart the most, and why? Which moment felt closest to your own life? Before you go, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always beautiful seeing our folktale family from all over the world come alive in the comments. If this story touched your heart, you can tap Join to be part of the team that helps choose our next stories and thumbnails. And if you ever feel led to, you can drop a super thanks. It helps us bring more powerful African stories to life. No pressure. Your comment alone already means the world.